And welcome back. So I haven't tweaked anything here because I just want to sort of keep going for now, and then I can work on this more later on. So let's jump straight ahead and do the flakes or the embers. So this is what I'm working on as a background element. I've got our main three sims, and the quickest way I think to deal with this will just be like, once again, it's for me completely avoiding complication. So why not just use this sim? We already know this looks cool when it's moving. So I'm thinking take that and just remove most of the points based on ID, so we can maintain our IDs for later as well. So ID modulus like 10,000. How much is that? 100,000. Yeah, let's go with that, 1,000 for now. I'll probably end up writing this out because it will be super quick to work with it, but for now, let's just keep moving on. So just by removing most of the points, we have a sim that could be used as embers. So let's just get some of this basic stuff out the way. I need the attribute transfer. To make sure that our embers appear and animate the same as the rest of the portal. And I'll take this position as well. I think my laptop's finally giving up on me. Okay. And then I could add, well, before this I could actually add a transform here and just sort of do a different rotation on it. Maybe scale it on Y so that the embers feel like they're falling into the room more. And then this is where I'm going to, I'll put down a null, and we can jump into another geo. So just quickly a recap on how I'm planning to split this up. Basically, because all of these layers are supposed to be part of the same effect, it makes sense that they're together in this geo, so I can jump between the different lanes. And same with this one, which will be portal D. But now this I'm considering as a completely separate element. I'm not a huge fan of, say, opening up someone's setup and you see like this huge network here, maybe another one here, and then they combining and channel referencing all over the place. But for me, this makes sense. So these are all to form the same effect. And now I'm kind of using the same sim and just editing it slightly here, and that's like my checkpoint. I can jump out, put down a new geo. Flakes. And then I'll just go ahead and object merge that in. If I can find it. Here we go. So there's our flakes. let's do some, do I have an alpha? Yeah. So let's do a couple of wrangles here quickly just for p-scale. So I'm just going to switch the viewport onto disks. So I mean, what we'll do is we'll copy geometry onto these points to represent our embers. So I want them to scale to 0, basically, so that the geometry scales and disappears. So let's just do p-scale is alpha. Is that working? Ah, that's why. So p-scale equals alpha times 0.01. So we have points that should be shrinking until they disappear. And then just to keep it simple, I'll have a different wrangle here to do a random p-scale, because we want the flakes to all be completely different scale from each other. So times equals, I'll do fit01 random ID between, let's do a min and max here. Alright, so where's my min? Oh, max and max. Min and max. Say 0.1 and 1. So there we have a random scale. And that's fine, but I like to use a ramp then to remap this randomization, because generally, and it's kind of like a 1/3 rule, you want, for me, 2/3 at least need to be really small, and then the last third is really big. So it's still completely random between them, but you want some to be huge, and it's not good enough to say every random point can be big and every other random point can be small, because that still just looks kind of messy. So if we put a ramp down for this, so we'll call that scale So what I mean by that is, when I'm randomizing this, I could have up to here pretty small points, and then for this last third they get really big. So if we compare that, I'm kind of making sure that most of the points are small. Let's just do this. Most of the points are actually small, and then just a few of them are really big. So let me just scale these up to kind of demonstrate a little bit more. So it gives you a lot of room to kind of get the exact look you're after. So for the most part, lots and lots of small ones, and then a few big ones. So something like that. Right, and then we want to generate the geometry to copy on. So I'm going to put down a grid. Don't know why it's always so big. Scatter some points here. Just a few. I'll just do 5. And then do a fracture. So this gives us 5 pretty differently shaped pieces of geo and a name for each one, which is useful. So I'll go down and throw a for each, because for each one of these we want to maybe put a mountain down, deform it slightly, and transform it back to the origin, because we're going to copy stamp this geometry onto these points. So each one should be at the origin. So right now I'm just basing the pivot on the center of the geometry, and then I'll transform. Transform that channel reference times -1. So here each one is deformed slightly and then moved to the origin. Then all we need is to delete everything except for one of them. So delete not selected, and then we have all these here. And then what I do is I'll replace this number with an expression, which is our stamp. So it's probably copy 1. So stamp copy 1, and then this string is just by a made up name for the stamp, and then our float. So let's put down that copy stamp. And why don't I see anything? Maybe it's just too small. There you go. So there's some flakes, but these are now copying just the same piece 0. So here in the stamp, enable stamp inputs, I need to call that switch. And here I'll do a fit again by ID between 0 and 4. And that's because our name primitives are, there's 5 of them, but it's named 0 to 4. So what I'm doing is replacing that number with our stamp. And it's not working now because this needs to be an integer. I mean, technically it is an integer, so I don't know why it complains, but it's like you need to force it to be an integer. There we go. So that should be picking up a random one of these and copying it on there, and also basing the scale off of our ramped p-scale here. So that's kind of, I'm pretty sure that's going to do the trick. I mean, we could have done a custom sim where we add vect flakes into the room, but I mean, all we really need, and And it's not like it's going to look like one of the layers we have, because we are scaling it down as well. So I think this is good enough, and then the flakes are going to shrink and disappear. So we might need to do something interesting with the shader. So just thinking about that now quick, if I put down a matte net here, what we could do is I could put a rest on the grid. So we have a rest position. So I could put down a noise in the shader, and that noise is not going to, the flakes aren't going to move through the noise because I can base the noise on the rest. So as an example, I'll put down another principled. And then say bind in rest. Which is a vector. And then put down a turbulent noise. So I'm actually just going to make a new mantra quick so we can have a look at this close up. So at the moment I just want to render flakes. Let's see if this works. I'll use scene view, flakes. Okay, so there's our flakes. Let's apply that material from inside. So nothing much to see there. So if I go in, I've got this turbulent noise. Let's just plug this into base color. Oh well, we'll plug it into emission as well. Plug it into opacity. Okay, well, it's doing something. So let me put down a ramp here. Okay, so you can see what I'm confident in is that because I'm using rest instead of position to base this noise on, the noise will stick to each piece. So that's why I'm doing that. And then here I just, I can mess around with this render view open to get an interesting flake kind of pattern on each one of those geometries. So another way you can do this is actually just do this in a VOP in SOPs until you feel like you've got the right kind of noise, and it'll be more interactive, and then you just redo it here in the shader. Or like me, you just jump straight into the render view and start messing around. But you can see something like that will give you an even more detailed ember than just using the geometry itself. So I mean, that doesn't look too bad actually. It doesn't look like we've copied the attributes from the point cloud, because our alpha should be coming from that. So we'd probably want to, take this result, multiply it by the alpha attribute. Although they do shrink until they do shrink based on the alpha, so we might not need to do that. and we want a nice emission color that matches the rest of our effect. Not really seeing it do much here. Oh, that's why. That was already blue. So it was taking the point color there. So that should be good. I think that should work. And it's very quick to render, so I can just... I mean, it hasn't taken long to make this whole extra layer. And I can just render that sequence out and immediately jump back in the comp and try it. So I will clean this up, and I'll clean this background layer up and make a mantra for each one, which will just basically be duplicating these ones we already have. I will need to add another take for Portal D. So I'll do that. And this flake one is fine because I'll just leave that off and force it in mantra. So when we come back in the next video, I'll have a quick recap if I've changed anything major, and hopefully I've probably rendered those 2 additional layers out and we can take a look at the comp. So see you then. Hi guys, I've cleaned this all up and I've actually rendered out the 2 extra layers that we made last time. So just as a quick recap, I've done this extrusion of the circle, scattered some points, done some ramps with the attribute transfer, and then I had this noise which I've been tweaking a bit. So I think that looks pretty cool. And it's the same as we had previously, but I did go back to the unified noise. And if you put down unified, you can see there's the normal one, and then there's one called unified noise static. So this one is completely bugged, but this one's working fine. So I don't know what the difference is between them. They look the same to me. But I use static and it's much quicker. But the same like theories apply whether you use your own a combination of noises like I used before, or just use this one. But it's basically the same. I have my rough Wally, which does the main shapes. Then I've got some extra roughness, and I use a warp to just kind of mess the noise up a little bit. And then I've got the ramps for the fall off and to clamp the values. So I basically just played around and experimented with that to get a nice full shape. And then all the usual stuff, adding color, the alpha, and I've kept this position noise, which is the one I have animated. And then I've scaled it up. So we know from frame 10 to frame 20 the portal appears, so what I've done is I've just scaled it on. It doesn't need to be fancy at all. We'll see what it looks like in the comp. And then still using the same attribute transfer for the closing animation, and then I've written that out. So you can see there how the attribute noise on the position is kind of giving us an interesting motion there. And I've taken the same, oh sorry, this attribute transfer is actually the one that forces the points to adhere to the circle. So like I'm doing with all the other layers, I've copied the same one, and it's basically just kind of confining the point cloud to the circle. Keeps it a bit neater and makes it fit a lot better with the rest of the effects, specifically the tunnel. So just to show you, I wanted it to fit a bit more exactly to that tunnel there. So we've got that, and then I've just duplicated the same setup here and made Portal D. And then similarly, I've written out the fewer points from particle A, and I'm just got a null there. And then in flakes, we've got the same thing. I've ended up removing a few more points, writing it out again, and then removing a few more. So I couldn't really decide on how many flakes I actually wanted. But I landed on that. This is all the same. And this is the same here as well. So you can just see quickly how these move. I think it works pretty well. We could have done a lot more sort of fancy things with custom sims, but for what we need it to do, I think it's fine. And then, as before, the noise on the shader. So I've added mantras for those. This should be D. And I've rendered them out. So let's jump into the comp. This is where we were before. And here's our two new layers. So this is what the new base layer looks like. So remember, this one is the completely unsimulated base. We're still just rendering points, but the movement's just coming from an attribute noise. And it doesn't really matter. It doesn't need to feel super realistic or anything in terms of its motion, because we just want it to kind of fill in the gaps in the background. And then our flakes are there. So I think that's actually working quite nicely. So I'll just quickly try and update this comp and get those in. I'm not going to spend too much time trying to make this comp look like final, but we'll just get these extra layers in there, and then in the next video we'll start to basically wrap up this whole first shot, or the first effect. So we just need to do some dust, some debris on the ground, maybe some extra particles in the dust, and then we'll render out all those environment layers and all those secondary effects, and then jump back into this comp and kind of finish it all up. So for now, let me just temporarily sort of merge these in. So we have this base effect. I'm going to do the same thing I've been doing, which is knock this right back. And then see, in this one I used the background to get it flat. I could also just basically gamma up this one, so don't gain back up, so it's still kind of flat. Maybe a bit more blue. And then use another one, branch off here, and really get some bright bits. So low gamma, high gain. I'll jump into the highlights tab, bring the saturation down. Oh, apparently there's no highlights. I'll knock it down over here. So just get something nice and bright and sharp, and I'll merge it back on here. Burn it in as usual. Let me save. So in this case, I'm just basically trying to convert my raw render into something that has a lot more information. So something like that. So you can see how it's gone from this and just knocking it back, there's not much going on, and then that looks much more complex. Really trying to maintain that fall off between what should be the brightest point, which is the ring, and then a nice fall off outward. So I'm just going to merge that behind everything else. Just burn all these on top. So I mean, this looks like a total mess. That's fine. I mean, we're doing so much to it over here, we're kind of bringing it all back together. So let's see if this is doing what we need it to do. So before I just had these layers, now I'm merging in the background and it's not doing much. So here's where I can start to tweak how much of that, you can see it there. If you look around this section here and I disable that, so it was completely dark. So I want to kind of fill that up a little bit. So I think these highlights are a bit too strong. So I think that's pretty much transformed this. Just that simple SOP-based point cloud. We need to remove that. And just disable this again. It's made a big difference, I think. It's really filled in that space. It feels a lot more cohesive. Yeah, I think this is feeling pretty good. So a lot of finessing we can do later on, but as a base comp, it works. And then I'll just throw these embers over I'll just merge them in after all of this. So I have made a mistake with the embers here. You can see that the circle is actually higher up, and that's because I was using that bulge to sort of push the whole effect further into the room, but I forgot to put that on the embers. Should be fine. So in this case, again, I'm looking at the end result and then coming back and adjusting the colors. And I think I'll do the same thing where I have a base that's got a low gain, and then I'll gamma down to keep only our super bright ones and merge that on top. So if I disable that, you can see I'm basically trying to fill up as much space as I can with pieces that aren't too intense, and then I'm just saving very intense ones and merging them back on top. And overall, if we compare that to just the raw render, there's just a lot more going on. So I don't know why Mantra has decided to add 2 watermarks to this. So let's just have a look and see how this all looks together. And then I think we'll leave it at that for now and probably wait until we have all the environment layers before we kind of tweak this too much. I don't think it needs to change too much from where it is. It might just be sort of playing around with different saturations, different brightness levels. I always find there's an argument for both variations in terms of intensity. So I feel like it's very easy to always think that a magical effect should be super bright, and even I fall into that trap where, so looking at the result, I'll come back to one of these and say brighten the whole thing up. And I'm like, ooh, that feels a lot more powerful. But at the same time, there's some very convincing magical effects, just actually surprisingly low intensity. So if you do something like this, because there's quite a lot of dark stuff in there, but you can see there's nothing particularly intense here, but it has a nice sort of realistic feel to it. So I'm always fighting with myself between super high intensity and a more naturalistic brightness. So that's probably more up to personal preference, or maybe how it looks in the environment. But when I'm usually tweaking this, I'll try both. So I'll go for a super intense one, watch it a few times, go for a dark one, maybe write them both out and watch them both over and over again. So we'll try and decide that a bit later when we have the environment. But I just like looking at the end result and just changing some values and seeing what it does. I really like this darkness. Looks super cool. So maybe if we do that and brighten up this base layer. That's also super cool. So, I mean, I'm pretty happy with this. I think there's so much interesting results you can get just from this small comp and these layers we have, that it's kind of like we can take this effect wherever we want it to go, really. So with that, I'll go back to how this was, and I'll catch you in the next one where we'll add the secondary environment effects. See you then. Okay, welcome back. So it's time for us to do some of the effects that aren't really the magical effects, so I don't want to spend too long doing this bit, so I might just do like a basic quick run through of the elements I'm thinking of, and then save all the tweaking for later. So I mean, if you guys have done any other work on smoke and dust and rigid bodies or anything like that. What I want is, as soon as the portal opens, I'm picturing this sort of sudden shock of dust reacting on the ground. So basically this thing finishes, it has that pop, I think from about frame 15 to 20, it sort of snaps open, and at that moment we'll have dust rolling out from this center point, rolling out into the scene. So that will be one volume sim, and then I'll advect some particles in that sim as well. So there's some sort of small particulate detail in that dust. And then this ground happens to be covered in small little rocks. So what I'm thinking is we can scatter our own small stones as well, and then use that dust volume as an advector force to push the stones. So we should see basically the environment, a bright blue flash when the portal opens, and then this expanse of volumetric dust, particle dust and debris reacting to that force. So it's not really a magical effect, but it's good to remember that as many sort of realistic physical effects you can build around the magic itself, the better the magic is going to look. So like I said, it's not really something I want to spend too much time, because there's obviously a lot of ways to do that, and I'm just going to do it the simplest way I can think of. So let's jump in here. You can see I've started actually coloring any renderable effects. I usually just color green, so I'm kind of sticking to my usual habit. Also, my naming is pretty consistent as well. So anything related to the portal is effects portal, and then whatever it is, because we need to do the magical shield as well, so that will just be effects shield blah blah. So let's try and stick to that as much as possible. So all I need is basically the same thing I'm using for the portal itself, some kind of sphere at this point that just forces volume outwards. So actually I might just copy our initial setup here, because I think we've pretty much got everything I would need in this basic volume sim. So let's at least start with that. So I'll pop that in here. Let's see what it does for us. So we have the sphere at the origin. We've got velocities outwards. Then we have these noises. Got that flatten. And then there's our volume source. So one thing I do want to do immediately is actually add some noise to the velocity amplitude here. So this noise, what happens if we just put V? Nope. I'm just going to do this the way I usually do. I'll put down a VOP. Take velocity and multiply it by a turbulent noise. And I'll put a ramp in here as well, just in case I want to clamp those values. So the idea here is just to break it up enough that it doesn't come out as a perfect ring. So something like that to give it some variation. And we only need this to start at maybe frame just before the portal fully opens, so maybe frame 18. So we've got density, temperature, and velocity. Let's see what happens. I mean, that's not actually bad. I do need to get a ground in here, so I'm just gonna make sure that my sim is set to the dust one, which it is. And I'll use the shelf tool ground plane. So just double check the height here. That should be fine. With this flat ground, there's no need to convert this into a collision geometry. So here we've already got a ground that should do the trick. So that doesn't look too bad. So that's just a sphere with a noise and a noise on the velocity. And I do need to end this, so let's say I'll take the source and say $f less than 30. So it'll only emit smoke between 18 and 30. Not too bad. So the question is, how do we make it feel much more impactful? So I'm just going to go and I'm going to boost the velocity first, but something else to bear in mind as well with volume sims is density. It's not just the way it looks. Changing the density value changes everything. So if you have a super high density, the way the simulation actually evolves is affected by that. So if I went super low but increased the visualization to be the same density, you'll find that the simulation's changed quite a lot. So you kind of have to experiment with different density values to find the right kind of look. So we just need something that breaks up enough to keep it interesting and with enough initial velocity to make it feel impacting. We can edit that as well after the sim, so maybe just throw down a scale. Another thing to try if you're using super high velocity values is to use a gas repeat. So sometimes, maybe instead of sub-steps, if you have a lot of velocity, the volume will start to break up and not look very good. So you want to run that sourcing process multiple times within that sub-step to force the volume to kind of fill itself out. So particularly if you have super high velocities here, it could be useful to repeat the sourcing process multiple times, just to make sure that it's consistently full. And then what I'll do is just put down a gas turbulence. So I'm just looking for something to add a little bit of detail and break it up at the same time. It's a bit much. So let me just do a quick flipbook of this. We'll see what we've got. So this feels a little bit small. It's doing the right kind of thing, but we need to exaggerate the scale that the scale of the effect that the portal has on the room. So I'm just going to try scale that sim up for now without spending too much more time playing around with volume settings in there. Once again, really benefits us to be working at the origin. Oh, that's much better. So I'll leave it at that for now and keep moving. I will need to tweak the settings a bit just to break up these edges, but I won't be doing anything fancy. As usual with me, there's no kind of super advanced techniques or anything. It's just quickly and simply getting something on the screen. So I could manipulate time, possibly, to try and make this feel more impactful. Or I could key that transform to make it more extreme. But I basically want it to really snap on. And then I think like the dissipation and stuff is fine. It's more the timing of it snapping on and making sure that the details are there. So let me just, as an example, try to key this one now. So say we started with 1.2. Maybe went until the emission stops. Set that to 2. And then in the ramp, I'd want it to really scale up really quick. So really quickly scale up and then reach its sort of equilibrium with itself. Still not very extreme. I think maybe something like this could even work, where you take a time shift and I'll just say if $f is less than, say, 23, then 0. Otherwise, $f plus 4. So in that way, if it's less than 23, nothing will happen. And when it hits 23, I'll actually just $f. So we just carry on playing from frame 23 of the sim. Maybe adjust this ramp as well to reflect that a little bit. So you can see kind of what I'm trying to do is really exaggerate that, the snappiness of that impact. So here the sim's already actually started, but we're cutting to it there and then very quickly scaling it up to its final scale. Something like that we could try. And actually I do want to move this then back to frame 18. Yeah, something like that. So this is one way you could do it, or you could spend more time tweaking the velocities, the velocity values in here, and actually get the volume to expand as quickly as you need it to. So I think both are valid options. Depending on how we use this volume, it might make more sense to actually get this result from the sim. Stuff like advecting particles and the forces we're using for the debris, it might be a lot cleaner if this is actually simulation based instead of transforms and time shifts. But more to demonstrate what I need from an artistic perspective is this very quick expansion here. So I mean, this is not going to be super dense in the scene. We just need a very subtle dust, but we do need it to feel quite explosive. So I will disable that stuff for now. Well, let me see, because there's a few options when we're advecting particles as well. So maybe the time shift stuff will be difficult to deal with, but we could actually counter animate the dust. Let me just remove this. So if I really speed this up, let's say, so let's say the dust starts growing at 18 again. And it grows only up until 23. Okay, and we know that the maximum is, say so let's go back to from scale 1 to 2. Then what I could do is do a reference copy of this So say we ROP this out. So we'll have our ROP. The file. Then we have this volume that's too big, basically. So here we just invert the transform. So we get back our normal sim, and all the values for velocity should be fine. And then in the particle setup, we just scale it up by 2, because we know that by frame 23 the volume is twice the size. So our particle source can be twice the size, and the volume that advects the particles can be twice the size. But by doing this, we've avoided having to actually use the scaling up volume in that sim. So we could do something like that, and also just maybe increase the time scale on the volume sim. So now we have a gas repeat, we've got a high velocity, we've got the dust simming at 2 times the speed, and I've got it scaling up. So all of that can add. I mean, if I do that though, I probably need to slow down or just make this turbulence a little bit less extreme. So basically I'm playing around with those options that I have. So time speed or time scale in the sim, gas repeat, the actual velocity value itself, transforming after the sim, and that should all filter through fine if we treat it like this into the particle sim. So let me quickly just see how this is looking now before we move on. Not too bad. So I'll leave that there for now, and I'll put down a new geo, and this can be maybe particles, let's say dust particles. So all we need here is to basically object merge in our counter animated volume. Fix portal dust, particle source. And then, like I said, because we know the volume sim itself is 2 times the size, we just scale this up here. So from frame 23, this matches the actual dust sim. So that can be our advection. And then at the same time, we need to grab, and I kind of usually do this instead of making a new source, is just take, so here's portal dust, and I have the rasterized points as a source. So all I need to do is basically scatter points into that volume. And then scale that up as well. So here we should be good to go with an advection. So basically, like we did with the actual portal itself, I just need all points from the input, and I'll set the activation to, I guess, 20. Oh, and our start frame can be 18 as well. And then a pop advect. Update velocity. Once again, I'm going to use trace because we do have high velocities. I'll see if we can actually compare the difference here. Oh, I haven't plugged this in. So we can see, well, there might be a few things going on here, but basically the particles don't look like they're doing exactly what the volume's doing here. And let's see what trace does. So you can immediately see, okay, it's not actually the same as the volume, but you can see a big difference of how well it's following the details of the volume sim. So I'll put that back to single step. It's kind of just a bit, it feels almost like viscous. And trace is a lot more exacting. So I think the other thing going on here is I have no collision for the pop. So if the particle is forcing the pop out, then it's not coming back into the sim. So I'll put down a wrangle here and just do our usual, say, if the Y position is less than 0, then Y is 0. So if we fall below the ground, just force us back onto the ground, and then hopefully we should get picked up by the volume. So that also made a pretty big difference. So that's pretty good, because instead of using an actual collision object, all we need is to prevent points from going below 0. See how extreme we can make that here. That feels pretty nice. It is eventually running out of the volume, so I'm not sure why. I think because the volume's just dissipating into nothing. So what we could do is just jump back into the volume sim, and actually I'm going to lengthen the dissipation here. So I'll say 0.1. We can always key the actual volume density afterwards if the volume needs to disappear faster. But for the particle sim, we need that volume to stay. Or at least stay for as long as possible. Because the other thing I can do is just put down a gravity here. Hello? Oh. Put down a gravity, and because the advection is set to a velocity blend of 0.5, it'll take at least half of what this gravity is trying to get the points to do. So it's a bit more physical. But I do want it to fly up a little bit. So something like that. And if we look at these together, we just need enough points in that render to really sell that this ground is covered in really gritty dust. It's going to be super subtle, but having just that flying, those flying points is pretty useful. Because sometimes that soft volume it just feels a bit CG. And if you can fill that up with tiny little points that kind of fly around the environment, it really helps. So what I would do is probably have at least 10 times more, maybe even more. So we go for a super dense point cloud. Let's go more. Super dense like this. And we just render them really small. So you just see them. The closer they get to camera, maybe the bigger. So if we have really tiny points there and a really low density volume, that should look quite nice. Okay, so right, so we have the dust and the sort of sandy points, and now I want some of this small debris on the floor to kind of react in the same way. So let's go again with a new geo. Vex portal debris. I'll just hide these two for now. So I pretty much am just going to use the volume sim and advect some rigid bodies, but I'll just set it to force instead of update velocity, because we just want that dust to kind of push the bullet objects away. So the first thing I need is I'm going to bring in the floor from the environment. So I've already got a group set up for floor. And that gives us that. And if I just look at this, I can kind of get an idea of how big I want the points to be. So I'm not actually going to use the geometry that's here. We'll just scatter some sort of new little pieces of debris to go in between. Okay, so I don't know how much we need at the moment. I'll start with that. And what else do we need? Probably a P-scale before we start copying geometry onto it. And then I think I'll actually just copy what we did for the embers, because basically most of the same things apply. So let's take, we don't have an ID, so I'll just take ptnum, random, put in a ramp, and this is the same thing I did with the embers in the wrangle, but I'm just doing it in a VOP. And bind export P-scale. I still like to use VOPs. I just like the visual nature. I mean, that's the whole reason I started to enjoy using Houdini back when I started. The kind of like just plugging stuff in type of programming to get stuff to work just really appealed to me, and the wrangles kind of takes that away. Okay, so let's just go with some small value for now and prepare some geometry. So if I jump back into my flakes, I have a copy set up here already with this this geometry that switches based on a copy stamp. So I'll use that. But over here I'll replace this with a cube. So I don't need that, don't need any of this. What I do need is to put a volume down so I can scatter in the volume, and let's say 10 points. So something like this, same idea, is I'll have now 10 chunks of geometry that have slightly different look to them. And obviously you could go pretty fancy with this. I could add, there's an interior detail now, RBD interior detail. So I could add interior detail to these pieces if I wanted them to look really detailed. I don't think I need to do that for now. Right, so let me just double check what I've got. So those are my flakes. So this all applies the same. I probably don't need this mountain. So all we need to do is move each one of those chunks into the origin. And then here's our stamp. And I have a random rotation on the copy. And I have our stamp. So the only difference here is I can't stamp by random ID. I need to stamp by PT. Obviously I could have made an ID attribute further up the chain over here, but the points aren't changing over time, so I can just use PT. And that's between 0 and 9 because I have 10 chunks. So there we go. Simple as that. And I probably do need to transform this up before we put it in a DOP. because it'll be sitting in the ground a little bit. So let's have a look at our scale here. Is this working? Yep. So once again, I'll keep a lot of small ones, and then at the end here kind of gain some size. So let's scale this down over here as well. And I'm just going to merge it on top of the environment just to check our scale. So I'm going to go a few more pieces here. And go a little bit smaller. Let's try that for now. So all we need to do is put down a DOP, and I need to object merge my dust again. So I'm going to actually take the same one. Where was I doing that? Is it here? Yep. So I'll take that object merge there. And what else do we need? Let me just start inside the DOP here. So I need a pack disk. RBD packed object. This can point up here. And I need a rigid body solver. Now the reason I'm not putting down a bullet solver, why can't I find this, is because the bullet solver has that, it's got one input for the object, and then it has that sort of multi-input tab on this side, and I can't get any kind of pop advection to work with rigid bodies using that. I'm not sure why. There must be a way to do it, but I just stick to the rigid body one. There's also an RBD solver, but it's got the same problem. So if you stick to the full rigid body solver, which, I mean, the only difference is it has the other ones as an option, as far as I know. Put down some gravity, and I also need the ground plane, which we do have in one of these DOPs already. So I just sort of start to pillage any network I can find. So just building out this basic DOP. And let's have a look at our collision geometry just to make sure it's fine. Not seeing anything, and I think it's because I need to actually still pack this. So I'll pack it on the copy and just double check that it's actually packed all of it, which it has. So let's have a look. So by default, I think the values for collision padding on the RBD object are a bit high for this scale. So I'll just go really small here. So that looks okay, and it looks like I'm a little bit too high off the ground as well. Doesn't need to be perfect because I think we'll need to freeze it before and after the force anyway. Okay, let's see how this looks playing. Yeah, they seem to be behaving themselves for the most part. You never know with Bullet. Okay, that'll do. And then advec by volumes again. We can just plug that into the last input here and use our second input. So we keep this, in this case, on update force. And there it goes. It's very weak. Wow. So you kind of just need to play around with these settings until you're happy. And I mean, one thing you can also do is just scale up the volume sim. So we're just, I mean, this doesn't need to fit 100% with what's going on with the dust and the particles. So I could do whatever I want here. So maybe let's just save and see how this looks all together. Just to see if it's if it makes sense, sort of in terms of the way it moves. So like here you have to imagine these being really tiny. So it's not like they're going to obscure the moving debris on the ground. But this is getting pretty tricky to visualize. So I think I can be just a little bit more extreme with the debris. And then obviously we need to lock off the bullet objects so that they don't move. That's cool. I kind of want something to at least move in the foreground. So at this point you could obviously play with the mass as well. In this case this force is ignoring mass. But you could introduce mass to have bigger pieces reacting less to that force than smaller pieces. So that looks okay for now. And then what I want to do is just time shift this. And I'll say maybe if $F is less than 18, then stay on frame 18. Otherwise, $F. because it doesn't matter if some random debris starts to rotate. Once they all start moving, it kind of makes sense. I'll just let this play out to see if these small pieces just carry on rolling around or if they're going to stop. Yeah, so there's some pretty strange movement going on there. So what I could do instead is just say start the simulation on frame 18. Well, I don't know what that does for me actually. I wanted to basically use this time shift to stop the debris from moving around, but I mean, that hasn't really helped me. I'll just say here, if it's greater than 96, then stay on 96. Okay, so we might need to play around with some friction or with that collision padding again to get them just to behave a little bit better. But the basic system's there. And what I do want to do is kind of play around with the dust sim. So I'm pretty happy with the way this is looking. But it could always have more detail, and I really want it to get to feel explosive. So I'll mess around with that a bit more. Basically, I have the three things here, and these all rely on that dust sim. So these all work now from a procedural perspective, and I'll jump back and just tweak that dust sim until I'm happy with it, and then just rerun all of these. So I think maybe we should just look at quickly shading each one of these elements, just with a pretty basic shader for now. Well, just before we do that, I just want to try one more thing with these debris, is maybe switch the collision geometry from convex hull to box, because then at least we'll have a flat surface that the debris can settle on. Wow, look at that. So it just slowly falls through the floor. And if I can just pick this up slightly. So it's still a little bit of moving around. That's strange. I thought that might fix it. It definitely helps. Let's see if I can do something else here. go a bit higher on this. No, even that doesn't really help us with some of the smaller pieces. So, I mean, I'm going to go a little bit bigger on some of these. I'm just trying to get this slightly more stable result than what we had. And the other thing is, I've just thought I should go minus 20 or something. So we actually have some pre-roll. So that actually looks good. So it's still moving slightly, but just a bit. And then we have, so we don't need that one, but we'll keep the one that deactivates them. Try a bit more here. So a little bit of movement, but nothing too major. Okay, I feel better. Right, now, let's do a few quick shader tests on these new elements. So let's do, I'm just going to duplicate this. So you can see we're building up quite a collection of mantras here. So we want one for our dust particles and for our actual dust. And the debris I'm going to add into the environment render. So I really want all the debris to look and feel like it's part of the scene. And I don't think I need to worry about rendering that on a separate layer for comp. So I'm just going to force the debris over here. And in the portal light environment, that should be fine. I don't think it needs to be in the character render. We will need it to be, let's have a look here. So we've got particles. So we need that to be set over here. And here we have our character cache as a matte, and I need the scene as a matte. So that looks fine. And then for our dust, I'm actually going to render a little bit smaller. And because the volumes, I mean, I am pretty much filling the camera with that dust. So I'll need to go for some lower settings, but it will be super transparent. So hopefully we can get away with a little bit less in terms of the render quality. And in this one, we need to force the dust and make sure that the character's matted out, the scene is matted out, and I'll matte the debris out as well. So let's do some tests. Now bear in mind, I will go back and do a higher res sim of the dust. So for now it's going to look very low res. And before I drop a shader on it, I'm going to switch off. I'm going to say visible only to primary and shadow rays. I have no need for secondary bounces here, and render time is going to be an issue. So I'll just do that. I actually want to remove the velocity field. Because I'll need motion blur on in the mantra for the debris and everything, but I don't want the volume to motion blur because that's once again just going to add more render time. So 1, 2, and 3. So we'll just keep density. And for now, actually, I'm going to put the environment in as well. It's much more useful to shade when you're looking at the final image. Oops. There we go. Okay, something's not right. I've probably still got something visible that shouldn't be. My lights are on. That looks fine. Oh, my LUT's gone. Why is that? Okay, so I'm missing the floor. So I probably clicked something off here. Looks all fine. It has a material on it. But it's completely missing in the render. Oh. Yeah, so always, I mean, that, I don't think that's what's causing the problem, but always remember if you're duplicating mantras and using takes to make sure you switch takes. Okay, so one of my objects was matting out, and I assume it's the debris. So my debris obviously has a ground in it, which it does. So because I'm object merging everything, I only need to object merge back out the RBD packed object. So that should fix that. Let's try that again. There we go. I was changing the wrong settings. I've been changing the debris instead of the dust. So the dust visible only to primary and shadow, and inside here I'll drop down a matte net and just put down a pyro. I'm going to set this to gray because the environment's 0.5 gray. And I mean, we don't need a fancy volume at all, so I'll just leave it at that and see how it looks. And then I do also have a shader already on the environment, which is just a basic principled shader set to gray. No reflection, nothing like that. So I'll just use that shader for the dust particles and the debris. So something I'm not seeing in here is the portal light. Because I've set this to null. That's just so that the scene still runs smoothly. Otherwise I can't really scrub because that geolight will continuously try and load that geometry. Okay, so that's way too dense, but it's the right kind of color and it's picking up some light. But yeah, I just need something really low density. So there's a little patch there I can see. So something like that is probably fine for now. And I am rendering it on a separate layer, so it's not a big deal if I need to change that. It's still picking up the light. I mean, I could try some different scattering maybe to get that light to bleed in a bit more or a bit less. But obviously with trying to shade with the render view open, it's going to take a while. So what I just want to have a look at now is see how dust particles and debris look. So I'm going to just apply that shader from the scene onto both of these. And another useful reason for even checking these is just to make sure all the matte objects are working fine as well. Obviously for the particles I need to make sure that the scale is right. Whoa, which it definitely isn't. Still kind of like it though. And another thing I need is quite a bit of motion blur on these points. So some super fine points here. There's probably too many of them now actually. So just some really nice sandy stuff here. And then make sure my velocity blur is on. Yep, so that's looking pretty good. That should look quite nice when it's moving. And then last, we'll just double check the debris, if I can find it. Oh, I don't have debris. I've just added it to the environment. So let's quickly, let me just remember to remove the environment from the dust render. And then I'll do a quick test of the environment render. And then what I'll do, if all this looks good and fine, I'll go back, clean things up, tweak that dust as I mentioned, and render out the layers we haven't rendered yet. So we do have all of these. So I need to render out the environment, the character, and the associated lights, and render out these new environmental layers. So in the next video, we'll dive deep into the comp and wrap this one up. So I'm just comparing now with and without debris. Yeah, that looks okay. So I'm just looking down here and they don't look out of place. So I guess the next question is, will we notice that the debris that's part of the environment isn't moving and yet some other debris is? And I don't think it'll stand out too much because our debris is actually a bit smaller. So it kind of makes sense that they're going to be moving and maybe heavier ones won't. So that's it for now. Let me get busy updating these elements, and I am going to launch all of those renders, and I'll see you on the other side of that.